How did the ancient humoral physicians conceive of the body? What did they think of disease? We hear of these things called the humors or pneuma, but where did they come up with that and why? We have the same bodies as they do. That hasn't changed in 2,500 years, and modern medicine doesn't believe in humors or pneuma now. You can't cut the body open and find them, so if they aren't actually there, what were they? Or maybe a better question is, what explanatory purpose did they serve? And why did they need that purpose? Why were ideas so different? And what did the ancient humoral physicians think was actually going on under the skin? Did it make sense? Was it workable? Internally consistent? And can we, as modern people, relate to it? Let's dive in. And as we do so, as always, it's helpful to know what shaped these ideas. After all, the purpose is in large part defined by the philosophy of the time, the culture, and the environmental pressures. So we'll spend a bit of time exploring, and to round it out, let's compare and contrast to other systems of the time, like classical Chinese medicine. I'm not a historian, I'm an herbalist. I want to know how systems work and why, and if they worked at all. As always, these are my views of humoral medicine as I understand it, and those views will undoubtedly change over time and after more research. So if you know more and would like to make any corrections, please feel free to do so below. And if you're interested in deep dives into classical medicine and the thinking behind it, be sure to like and subscribe for more content. Let's say you're an ancient Greek living around 500 BCE. You live a pretty typical life for the time. You've got a little farm, you raise sheep, you have a vineyard, you don't have emails to check or some boss to answer to. You have your own schedule. You get up when you want to, you work hard outside, and you go to bed when the sun sets. As far as places to live in that time, it's not too bad. Your physical world is pretty ideal. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. It's pretty balanced. Your mental world is filled with gods and nature spirits and ancestors. And in your view of reality, there's not a real difference between what might be called the physical world and the world of those gods and spirits and ancestors that you see as directly affecting that physical world. After all, a bad harvest is because the gods are unhappy. Maybe you didn't sacrifice enough to ensure the rains. Maybe your sheep have died for no reason you can think of, except that you built a new house without making sure the land wasn't inhabited by a spirit, a chthonic daimon. Or maybe you knew, but you didn't appease that spirit enough to convert it from a chthonic daimon to a benevolent agathos daimon, and now the land is cursed. Now let's say that you got sick. You have vomiting and diarrhea. Worse, a couple of days later you wake up with yellowing eyes and skin. What do? Of course, there would have been treatments passed down orally for generations and generations. There would have been a general knowledge of medicinal plants and what they treat, and certainly there would have been a kind of linguistic framework to say what they were used for. In most cultures, ancient disease descriptions look like environmental descriptors applied in metaphor to the body. So you've got a fever and you're yellow. That means somehow you contracted heat. And there would have been plants that were thought of as cold to treat it. But what happens if you take them and they don't help? Now what? Looking at your yellowing skin that feels hot to the touch, how do you know what's going on? How do you know what's happening underneath your skin, in the darkness that your eyes can't pierce? Being a farmer, you've butchered enough livestock to know that you're filled with the same organs, and there must be a vague idea of what they do, but beyond that, how could you possibly know what's going on? Maybe you even feel like you shouldn't know what's going on. It's a hidden world. A world made by the gods. What right do you have to enter it? Your worldview at the time is theistic, and everything is explained through it. So naturally, this means that if you're sick, it's because something made you sick. Just like a bad harvest is a sign of displeasure, if you're sick, it's because you pissed somebody off. The only thing you can do is to make amends and say you're sorry to the gods or spirits, if you can figure out which one of them is mad at you. Or maybe you can bribe them by offering them something, or even threaten them by asking for the help of a bigger god. And after all that, you might have died of acute hepatitis. Or maybe you get better. Who am I to say the gods weren't real and appealing to them didn't work? But nonetheless, something incredible happened before the turn of the millennium. The world that was at one time created by and governed by the gods was somehow conceived of in an entirely different way. Across the 6th to the 4th centuries BCE, Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratics, the Hippocratic writers, and then Plato and Aristotle reframed the world as lawful and intelligible. This natural science described the world in an entirely novel way, not as at the mercy of the whims of the divine and forever hidden, but as the result of knowable laws and principles that described change in a material world. This cosmology put forth a causal chain of being. There was an organizing principle. There were causes, changes, elements, forms, organs, and organisms. And this view of the world is what informed humoral medicine. After all, views of the body are created by worldview, man's understanding of the cosmos. People need coherence between the inner and outer world, including the cosmos, politics, and economy, and the human body. In short, natural philosophy and views of the body confirm one another. Aristotle himself in his Politics says, "It is evident that the state is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal. And he who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. He is like the tribeless, lawless, hearthless one whom Homer denounces. The natural outcast is forthwith a lover of war." He further says in Politics, "Nature does nothing in vain," and repeats this again in Parts of the Animals. "For nature never makes anything superfluous or in vain." And further in his Physics, he says, "We must explain then that nature belongs to the class of causes which act for the sake of something." So again, political, biological, and cosmological ideas inform one another. They don't arise in a vacuum. And Galen, the foremost humoral physician of the classical period, who brought humoral medicine to supremacy in the Roman Empire, pretty much quotes Aristotle verbatim, saying, "Nature does everything for some purpose and nothing in vain." So we clearly see the basis of humoral medicine and its views of the body rest firmly on the natural philosophy of the time. Of Aristotle's theory of cosmology, several things are important in how they influenced humoral views of the body. First, there is the organizing principle called Physis. Then there were the elements, the basic material substrate. Then there were the changes, which described a transformation of those elements. In medicine, the organizing principle was also called Physis in Greek, or Natura in Latin. The material substrate was the humors, a direct correlation with the elements, and the forces that enacted upon them and affected change were called the faculties. Now, often when we talk about the structure and function of the body, we think about it just like that. Structure, then function. University classes teach anatomy and then physiology. Matter in the universe isn't seen to exist for the sake of anything, and changes are strictly material processes. So when this is applied to medicine, it's framed as anatomy first, and that anatomy has some kind of function, which is physiology. But the ancient humoral physicians didn't believe this. And even if they were more materialist than what preceded, meaning that they didn't think that the body, health, and disease were the result of divine forces, they still held that there was some kind of principle that gave order. So instead of starting with anatomy, the parts of the body, it's probably better to start with physiology, or maybe tackle them both at the same time. Because the question that consumed ancient humoral physicians wasn't, what is the body made of? But rather, what is the body trying to do? And how does nature organize itself to do it? This view was teleological. Form exists for the sake of something. Then, some Hippocratic physicians, notably Galen, went a step further with the view that the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm. Cosmic forces mirrored and influenced correlated forms in the body. The idea that the human body reflects the ordered cosmos, the microcosm mirroring the microcosm, was influential, especially in Platonic and Hermetic circles. Pertaining to medicine, there is the correlative cosmology of linking the humors to the seasons, organs, temperatures, temperaments, foods, herbs, etc. Later, this would also inform such things as the doctrine of signatures of the late Middle Ages and the medieval Latin term homo microcosmos, the human as a little cosmos. Returning to the organization of the cosmos, because this is what is adopted into the model of the body, Aristotle postulated the following. Physis, or principle, then heavenly motion, then contraries in prime matter, then elements, then mixtures, then parts, then organisms. So how can we understand this? There is clearly a world around you. Forms and things, there's weather, there's movement of the heavens, and then there's you. But how did any of this get there? And how does it all relate together? If you no longer say, well, a divine somebody did it, and that's just what the divine somebody wanted, so this is what we get, well, then you have to start explaining things. Now, in the classical world, it's natural to think everything exists for a reason, because in nature, everything seems to fit perfectly into place. Animals have niches in the ecosystem. Life responds to the impulse of the seasons, which would have been front and center in an agrarian society. Your body itself is a kind of perfection of organization that completes a function, which is the function of being whole and integrated with all of the parts and processes, perceptions, sensations, and thoughts working together. Modern science calls that evolution, but earlier peoples called that design. So if you have a plan or design, you have to somehow bring that into being. Aristotle doesn't just say, meh, intelligent design, and then walk away, because how is that different than saying something is caused by the gods? That just makes the gods impersonal, and it doesn't explain anything. Also, importantly, this plan or design wasn't a singular design. It wasn't a grand orchestration of all things into cosmic narrative. Everything had design. Every form, every being had its own design. And design wasn't the will of some agent. It was the pure potentiality inherent within a thing to be that thing. So where it gets interesting is in how things come into being. A design has to act through something. The blueprint of a house or the schematic of a machine is just an idea. You have to put actual things together to make it real. In Aristotle's Cosmology, the heavens and matter simply exist. They are eternal. There is no creation or destruction, just change. And that's not so different than what we think now, except for maybe the extent of what change means. So the design, pure potentiality, drives the movement and change of something to be what it is. It sets the heavens in motion to make the seasons, and it also acts on existing matter. The matter that it acts on first is called prime matter. This is undifferentiated matter. And because it is undifferentiated, it holds all of the unrealized potentials of what it could be. These unrealized potentials are what are called the prime contraries, which are qualities which will be imprinted or imbued into matter as it becomes more tangible. And these are hot, cold, wet, and dry. When these qualities are imprinted on prime matter, then they become the elements of fire, air, water, and earth. And the elements themselves are really just designations of qualities of what prime contraries they are made of. So, fire is hot and dry, air is hot and wet, water is cold and wet, and earth is cold and dry. The potentiality of quality in prime matter becomes actualized into something more tangible just because it's its nature to do so. These elements also all act upon each other, causing each other to change and transform, which explains how nothing is permanent in the physical world, even when matter itself is seen to be eternal. And this is Aristotle's law of transformation, where any one quality could change to its opposite with the right pressures. And if an element is two qualities, if any one quality changes, it's now a different element. Fire is hot and dry, but if it changes to hot and wet, now it's air. And the mixing of all of these elements in differing percentages is how you get a thing or a form. These forms then combine to build more and more complex things like organs, and then finally organisms. So Aristotle's model might be described as a causal chain of incarnation. But it's also circular, because the final thing that's brought into being is the realization of the pure potential that existed in the thing itself as the design, or physis. And so I think we have to be careful with the word causal, because that implies something sequential in time. But really, it seems like this has to be happening all at once, in a kind of co-arising way. And important to this in regards to how it influenced humoral medicine is that movement between these tiers happens because of something Aristotle calls the causes, which explain how change happens. So if this is the process in the natural world, there has to be a similar process in the body because the body is part of the natural world. In fact, everything is part of the natural world, so everything must behave in a similar way. And of course, Aristotle did think this was happening in the body because he explicitly said so. But he wasn't a physician, and his descriptions weren't medical theory. They needed to be adapted into a theory that was usable. So how did humoral doctors accomplish this? How did they make a similar map of the body? Galen, taking inspiration from Aristotle's Cosmology, focused on physis, the changes, and the elements, adopting and altering them for his own medical models. Physis was the same, but the changes were transformed into the faculties, and the elements were given the direct correlates of the humors. So let's look at the faculties, because these are core archetypes of physiology, which would later be expressed in the humors and specific organ functions. Galen based the faculties roughly on Aristotle's changes, which described how things came into being. But he took it a step further and said that faculties were not just descriptions of change, but the cause of change. They were, in the body, archetypal impulses. He describes 4 natural faculties: attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion. And these explain how organs draw in nourishment, cook and transform it, hold it until ready, and eject waste. From this ongoing cycle comes the larger outcomes of growth, when assimilation exceeds maintenance, and generation, when new life is formed. Aristotle classifies the act of becoming into 4 kinds of change: generation and corruption, which is change of substance; alteration, which is change of quality; growth and diminution, which is change of quantity; and locomotion, which is change of place. Galen keeps the teleological framework of nothing in vain, and the primary qualities of hot, cold, dry, and wet, then assigns powers or faculties to explain how bodies actually work. Functionally, Attraction and expulsion are directed locomotions of material. Alteration remains Aristotle's alteration, for example, digestion. Retention enables assimilation, whose result is growth. And generation and corruption mark threshold transitions rather than a separate physiologic faculty. In short, Aristotle classifies what kind of transformation occurs, while Galen specifies which power does it, and in which parts, and coordinated by which ruling organs and executed across which tissues. The correspondence is inspirational, not one-to-one. Galen's cycle leans on alteration and locomotion, treats growth as the outcome of retention plus transformation, and leaves generation and corruption as threshold events rather than a distinct physiologic faculty. The faculties act on the humors, but because the humors are the direct correlates to the elements, to understand them we need to look at the elements first. And again, these qualities, according to Aristotle's theory of elemental transformation, could swap. Hot could become cold, cold could become hot, dry could become wet, and wet could become dry. So they had dynamic qualities based on their temperature and moisture. And if any single quality of an element changed, the element itself would change. This means that the elements are not static but moving. Not wholly physical things, but also descriptions and explanations of processes. They lie between prime matter and what are called uniform bodies. And as we said, the four humors were the direct correlates to the elements. Fire was linked to yellow bile because both were hot and dry. Air was linked to blood because both were hot and wet. Phlegm was linked to water because both were cold and wet. And earth was linked to black bile because both were cold and dry. This means that both the elements and the correlated humors have the potential to do the same thing. Fire and yellow bile are both hot and dry, both move upward and are expansive and consuming. Air and blood are both hot and wet, expansive and transformative. Water and phlegm are both cold and wet, flowing, moistening, and descending. And earth and black bile are both cold and dry, congealing and sinking. So we directly see the structure of the natural world mirrored in the structure of the body. However, the body is more complex than the natural world. In the natural world, the elements can move and transform by virtue of their temperatures and moistures. But that's not enough in the body. In the body, those fluids, the humors, are inert, just potentials. In the body, you need two more things: innate heat as catalyst, and pneuma as a vehicle or direction. Let's look first at the innate heat, the vital heat of life. This is calor inatus, the life heat or life fire of the body. This is the heat in the body, blood, and fluids. It is the one thing that defines life itself. This is true now, but even more so when death was front and center in the pre-modern world. Because the most obvious thing that separates a living being from a well-preserved corpse is heat. One is warm, and with that body warmth, there is function and process. The other is cold, and there's no life process. This calor inatus is dispersed everywhere in the body. But Galen sees this as being fanned in the furnace of the heart, where it can be made to radiate out with the vital spirit through the arteries in usable form to all parts. Now, we might look at this and think this just means body heat, the byproduct of metabolism. After all, calorie derives from calor, so we might be tempted to think that this heat is basal body temperature held within the fluid of the humors and body liquids. But that wasn't actually how it was looked at. The ancient Greeks viewed heat as a kind of fluid substance in its own right, and the inner fire was a kind of life essence or subtle material flame, which was the active principle of life. This inner fire was inherited from the parents and existed everywhere in the body, but was fanned in the heart and thereby radiated outward in usable form with the help of the pneuma. Pneuma, meaning breath or spirit, is seen to be a fine, airy substance that permeates blood and tissues and is the vehicle or medium that carries and applies life's powers in the body. It carries sensations and will, and is the connection of senses to the mental faculties and perception. There are 3 types of pneuma of differing grades of refinement. This was developed more in the later Galenic tradition, but we can still talk about it here. First, there is the spiritus naturalis, the natural spirit, also known as the vegetative spirit or appetitive spirit. It's the spirit or quality of consciousness basic to all life. Its function is nourishment and building, and it is formed in the liver in the blood. From the veins of the liver, it goes to the right chamber of the heart, where impurities are exhaled by the lungs. The blood, carrying the natural spirit, trickles through pores from the right chamber to the left, where it is refined via inhalation. Air mixes with the natural spirit in blood to form the spiritus vitalis, the vital spirit. From the heart, pneuma travels to the brain, where it is further refined into the spiritus animalis, the animal spirit. Now, it has to be pointed out, Galen describes pores in the wall between the left and right ventricles of the heart that the blood moves through. And of course, we know that there are no pores between the right and left chamber of the heart. This is anatomically inaccurate. This came about looking at animal dissections and applying observations to the human body. Looking again at cross-cultural similarities between the Greeks and the Chinese, remember that pneuma starts in the liver. So life and nourishment start in the liver. We can expand on that. Both systems actually have life starting in the liver. The ancient 5-element system starts with wood, which correlates to the liver. The liver also correlates to blood. Fetal development in the womb starts with the correlative category of the liver. Wood is spring, the starting of the new year, and seeds sprout in spring. In humoral medicine, the liver is also correlated with spring, thus germination and growth. And while Aristotle believed the heart was the first organ to form, Galen believed it was the liver because all other organs and functions depend upon blood. Now, this is quite interesting. Why would 2 unrelated systems come to the same conclusion? Clearly, they weren't talking only about the liver organ, but everything the liver represented as a functional category. And direct textual or medical transmission via the Silk Road is debated, and many scholars think similarities likely reflect parallel development. We can also compare pneuma to the classical Chinese concept of qi. Qi is a broad sweeping concept, but in the body it was a kind of subtle fluid or gaseous movement that directed vitality and was necessary for sensation and perception. And qi follows a somewhat similar generation as pneuma in that it is a byproduct of metabolism of food that sees refinement in the chest via inhalation. So it's interesting to look at these similarities and wonder. But there are some key differences too, so we should be cautious of the tendency towards a kind of universalism. For example, qi and blood flow in the same vessels in Chinese medicine, but the refined pneuma of this spiritus animalis, the animal spirit, in Greek medicine flows in the nerves. And this points to another difference, and that is the seat of consciousness. Classical Chinese medicine held that it was in the heart. And while Aristotle also thought it was the heart, Galenic humoralism held that it was in the brain. Now that we've talked about the faculties, the humors, the calor inatus, and the pneuma, we have to talk about where body processes actually take place, and that is the organs. And now we get into actual anatomy. The elements and the faculties act upon the organs, which means that the individual organs have an elemental affinity and a humor seated within them. For the primary organs, the humor of the liver is blood. Blood is correlated with air, so the liver is hot and moist. The humor of the gallbladder is yellow bile. Yellow bile is correlated with fire, so the gallbladder is hot and dry. The humor of the spleen is black bile. Black bile is correlated with earth, so the spleen is cold and dry. The humor of the brain, and by extension, in humoral medicine, the lungs, is phlegm. Phlegm is correlated with water, and so these organs are cold and moist. The heart, meanwhile, is not the seat of a humor, but rather serves as the furnace of innate heat and the seat of the vital spirit, but is also seen to be hot and dry. Secondary organs did not all have associated humors, but they too were given characteristic qualities of temperature and moisture. This means that an organ has a tendency as dictated by its elemental quality, and this tendency is actualized by the action of the faculties upon those humors and those organs. So, for example, the stomach attracts food, retains it, and alters it by pepsis or cooking, then expels chyme. The liver attracts chyle from the gut, alters it into blood, retains and stockpiles it, and expels residues via the gallbladder and the spleen. The heart concentrates vital spirit and propels it through the arteries, with the lungs attracting air and tempering cardiac heat. The kidney and bladder complex and the uterus are all governed by retention and expulsion. The elements then set each organ's baseline, or ability to do any of this. Classically, the heart was hot and dry, the liver was warm and moist, the brain was cold and moist, the lungs cool and moist, the spleen cold and dry, the gallbladder hot and dry, and the stomach moderately dry for the initial stages of digestion. And it was because of the hot and dry, cold and wet qualities that the functions could work through them and they could accomplish their jobs. When that qualitative mix shifts, the faculties misfire. Excess cold and wet in the stomach weakens attraction and digestion. Excess heat and dry in the heart and liver overcooks and drives harsh expulsion. Cold and dry in the spleen over-retains melancholic residue, and in the lungs retains phlegm. So if we go back to the example from the beginning of being sick, the symptoms were vomiting and explosive diarrhea, followed by fever, yellow skin, and yellow eyes. Let's also say that there's bitter taste and yellow urination. Today we would recognize that as foodborne hepatitis. In pre-humoral medicine, that would have likely been described as heat, and maybe they would have described it as being heat in some place. Maybe the stomach, or if there was liver pain, heat in the liver. And there would likely have been empirical herbs proven to help in such cases. But ultimately, the cause would have been some kind of supernatural influence, and the treatment, therefore, would have centered around that. But now, with humoral medicine, you have a completely different way of describing the cause of illness, and therefore a completely different way of treating it. You have a model and a diagnostic signs and symptoms. So let's break it down. Yellowing of the sclera and skin is excess yellow bile mixing with the blood. Yellow bile arises as a separation from blood in the liver and is stored and then expelled by the gallbladder. Overheating of the hepatic region overcooks the bile, which then mingles with the blood, leading to signs of jaundice. So, if there's excess, or if it's too hot or not moving correctly, it all points to the liver. So the liver is running too hot, which overcooks the yellow bile, which mixes into the bloodstream and produces the bilious signs of bitter taste, dark urine, yellowing of the sclera and skin, and a tendency to vomit or have diarrhea. The stomach also overcooks the food, which contributes to the bitter taste and the nausea and the explosive diarrhea. This also tells you what you need to do. You need to cool the liver and purge the heat, as well as the heat in the stomach. And so you would look in your materia medica and formulary to see what would be appropriate, looking for herbs that are cold and moistening and acting on the liver and stomach. You'd be looking at herbs like the classic bitters, like gentians and fumitory, and cooling purgatives like rhubarb root. Now at this point, we can pause for a little aside because naturally we'll have some questions. We've talked about the faculties, the humors, the elements, the pneuma, the calor inatus, and a little bit about the organs. So for starters, we might ask, were the humors real? Did the humoral physicians think they were? I initially thought they were entirely metaphor, as some later writers, even medieval writers, thought. And now I'm on the fence. Galen says that they are material substances, and that it is the blood that contains the mixtures of them. In fact, in certain kinds of treatment like bloodletting, it is seen you are getting rid of actual humors. But then again, he also says that you can't see them, and you can only know that they are there by inference. Also, neither he nor other physicians of the time could completely agree on the number. Galen, for example, creates subcategories of humors, which just look like more humors. So were they real or not, or quasi-real? Were they a kind of archetype or proto-vital fluid? This is just my take on it, but even when Galen is very clear that he thinks a humor is real, for example, when he says that a drug for attracting phlegm in the case of jaundice will remove exactly 4 ounces of phlegm, is that really phlegm being removed? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it just means X treatment caused X positive change in body function, which incidentally caused X fluid to come out. Maybe it's not the fluid that is important, but the restoration of the process that removed the fluid. Who knows? But pragmatically, if the patient gets better, it doesn't really matter. You've proven the system works. Now, regarding the pores between the ventricles of the heart that was mentioned earlier, those don't exist in human beings. Those were seen in animal dissections, and the observations were applied to people. And so these anatomical inaccuracies, plus humors that can't be seen, plus abstract concepts like pneuma and innate heat, might seem overly philosophical and inexact. And we might not be comfortable thinking of the body in this abstract way. It seems divorced from the tangible and provable physical reality, which has such a primacy in modern thought. So we might think, it's kind of risky to think of a material body in such an immaterial way. How could you have medicine that works based upon such abstraction? And that's a fair question. But another, maybe more important question was, did it actually matter? Much of the efforts to overthrow humoral medicine centered on the fact that humors were never proven to be real and tangible things in the body, but were in fact disproven, and that humoral anatomy was not really exact. But does it matter that the humors are not findable and the anatomy is not exact? What does that change? Of course, it does matter if you're doing surgery. If you're cutting the body open to remove something you expect to find, and it's not there, you have a problem. It also matters if you're trying to justify bloodletting as a way to get rid of a certain humor. If there is no physical humor, then what are you getting rid of? But does it matter if your modalities are dietetics or lifestyle advice or herbal medicine based on a functional model of pharmacology, even if that's ancient pharmacology? I would argue no. All that matters is the system is diagnostically accurate and you get predictable results. And by diagnostically accurate, we're not talking about the accuracy of whether there is a certain amount of real humor or not. We're talking about the ability to describe symptoms and put those symptoms into patterns that are coherent and logical, and then have a treatment modality that predictably creates positive change to those symptom patterns. And consider that even now, we don't really know why some drugs work in modern medicine. We just know they do. Take lithium anesthetics, and even metformin and Tylenol. They're not completely understood. We don't know exactly and entirely how they work. And we don't need to know how they work necessarily in order to be able to use them. So, not understanding anatomy or having a model that is not completely accurate is not a deal breaker. What you really need is a system that is logical, rational, and predictive, because you are operating in larger patterns of correlation and causation, and you do have such a thing with this system. And we can pause for a moment to appreciate how unique this was, because medicine of the time was a marked shift away from the medicine before. For the first time, life did not depend upon the justification of the divine. Change, transformation, illness, and health were now natural processes. This is completely different than viewing the world as governed by myth, omen, or divine whim. Now the world was governed by processes that could be observed, reasoned about, understood, and predicted. Before Hippocratic medicine, the body was often explained through stories of divine favor or wrath, through ritual pollution and purity, through demons, spirits, and gods who sent disease as punishment or test. To describe the body instead as a rational system of elements, motions, and faculties was to relocate health and illness away from the realm of theology into the realm of nature itself. Of course, this wasn't going to last. When humoralism spread to the Middle East and Europe, God was reinserted as the organizing principle. And as long as we're on a little bit of a tangent, we can stop and wonder, why did this change happen at all? And why then? What external forces caused this shift in worldview? I'm not a historian, so I can't speak with authority about the entirety of what was happening at the time. But it is important to note the shift to democracy. That must have had an effect upon worldview. It's a completely different way of legitimizing ruling power than what came before. And when we look again to Aristotle's statement in his Politics, he says, "It is evident that the state is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal." So prior to, power was legitimized by divine forces, either by the divine right to rule or the favor of deities upon aristocratic families or warlords. But with democracy, it became a self-organized, shared power not dependent upon the divine. Because we need coherence of worldview, when extended to the body, this takes the justification of life from a cause outside of the body to something intrinsic to the body itself, a pattern of nature that could express no other way. So we've touched upon the faculties, the humors, the pneuma, and the calor inatus. Let's clarify this relationship just a bit. By virtue of the faculties, the underlying force, the humors have directions, tendencies, and transformative potentials. And the humors exist as quasi-material substances to manifest the movement of those faculties. This is dependent upon the innate heat as catalyst and the pneuma as direction. So now we can return back to the humors with the understanding that humors are a kind of potential for change, movement, and transformation that must be further actualized by the direction of pneuma and the catalyst of the calor inatus. Let's detail what these specific movements of the humors are. The element of fire is hot and dry and moves upward, so its associated humor, yellow bile, is also hot and dry, and due to its heat is light, it moves upward and is consuming. Air is hot and moist, it also moves upward but is more moderate, and its associated humor, blood, is upward spreading and buoyant. Water is cold and moist, heavy and flowing, and its associated humor of phlegm is also heavy and flowing. Earth is cold and dry, heavy and sinking. Its associated humor, black bile, is also heavy and sinking. All of these movements of humors in the body have an effect upon all fluids, including foods taken in and waste excreted, as well as the movement of nutrition to where it's needed. Therefore, they govern the movement and transformation of foods and liquids into physiologic substance. Healthy physiology, then, is the proper movement of fluids, i.e. humors, in the body, and therefore pathology is lack of governed movement. This is why pathology is conceptualized as buildup or stagnation of bile or blood or phlegm. Fluids have stopped moving. That's the primary concern. There can certainly be too little of a given humor, but if all humors flow in the blood, then in a given volume, if there's too little of a substance, the space that would have been occupied by that humor is now occupied by something else. So it seems in ancient Greek humoral medicine, pathology was believed to result more from the lack of movement of the humors than it did from any kind of lack of amount of the humors. This means that the main causes of disease were accumulation and stagnation. And there are tons of examples of this. In epidemics, Hippocrates wrote of a certain epidemic where those who had the greatest rate of survival were menstruating women. And this was because the passage of blood did not allow for the pathologic stagnation of blood. In other epidemics, it was noted that those who passed blood in stool or vomited were more likely to live. There was the belief at the time that men were more likely to get chronic illnesses because, again, they didn't bleed every month, so were more likely to have stagnant blood. Anything that couldn't open but should was guaranteed to make the humors back up and cause illness. Sex was viewed in the same way. Galen thought lack of sex could make you crazy. This was for both men and women because you're not getting rid of substances that could accumulate. According to Shigehisa Kuriyama, even Diogenes, who was quite an ascetic, had sex in order to get rid of the buildup of harmful substance. And finally, in regards to respiration was used to refine the vitalis naturalis into the vitalis spiritus, but it was also essential in that it acted as a fan that kept the body from overheating, which was a grave concern. What makes this fascinating is that the classical Chinese view was completely different. Classical Chinese medicine viewed the primary cause of illness as being deficiency. The body may certainly get stuck. Fluids, blood, lymph, the bowels, and urine might not move, but this was more often due to a weakness of the body than the body simply getting stuck on its own. The main concerns were loss of blood, loss of qi, loss of yang, loss of jing in sex, loss of fluids and oversweating, and the preoccupation, at least for the wealthy aristocrats, became don't work hard, don't sweat too much, don't have too much sex. And this created its own problems, to be sure, and much is said about the difference in body types between the flabby and weak rich and the wiry and robust farmer. But nonetheless, the concern was definitely in losing substance. In short, the ancient Greeks thought of the body as having an inner flame that might burn out of control if it wasn't circulating enough, or if it wasn't cool enough and there weren't clear exits for waste. The Chinese, on the other hand, thought the body was a flame that always threatened to go out and must be safeguarded. This led to very different cultural biases that exist to this day. In the West, we are obsessed with toxicity. We believe that we have overloaded livers, bowels, and bladders, and that we don't sweat out toxins enough. If we tend to go any direction, it is in the belief that the stomach and the intestines are full and stuck. The gallbladder has sludge, the blood is congested, etc. We starve of fever. We work out hard when we have a cold. We do lots of saunas. Colonics and enemas are big in the alternative health industry. We do all kinds of fasts, take all kinds of supplements to detox, and on and on. And this all comes from ancient Greek thinking that colors our perceptions to this day, and feeds directly into much of the alternative health industry, which is simply plugging into latent biases that most people don't realize they have. In contrast, in Asia, there is a preoccupation with supplementing and building energy, building qi, building blood, building yin, building yang, conserving energy, not overdoing it, not working out too much, not having too much sex, not sweating, etc. It's all perspective and bias. And the more you think about it, you really start to wonder, why do we do what we do? What assumptions do we have that we take as truth? This is a very interesting topic, and you can read more in Shigehisa Kuriyama's The Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine. It's an absolutely fascinating read that I cannot recommend enough if you're interested in this sort of thing. And of course, in saying all of this, these observations are not meant to be black and white generalizations. The Greeks would certainly have been concerned with weakness and deficiency. And that's one of the things that was looked at to determine if harsh treatments like bloodletting were appropriate. And to be sure, the Chinese were also very concerned with excess and buildup, and clearing things out of the body was essential. But nonetheless, the underlying bias was still there. But to return to the actual topic at hand, let's recap. There is Natura, which is the natural organizing force of the universe and the body. This organizing principle is actualized through the power called the faculties. Co-arising and mutually dependent upon one another are Pneuma, the breath-like gaseous substance that moves heat, thus life, throughout the body. Calor Inatus, the animating warmth of the body necessary for life. And finally, the humors themselves, the archetypal fluids that contain and hold the Calor Inatus and are moved by the Pneuma. Said another way, the humors, in various combination, complete the job of the faculties, being attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion. They do this by their temperature and moisture content, and aided by Pneuma for direction, and Calor Inatus for catalyst. And the location they do this is in the organs. In general, you could say blood nourishes and warms. It's buoyant and attractive. Yellow bile is incisive and separating and tends toward purgation and expulsion when in excess. Phlegm moistens, buffers, stores, and slows. Black bile is cold and dry and congealing, and in excess it obstructs and hardens. Illness, then, is breakdown of this system. It doesn't matter if you call it a pathogen. It doesn't matter if it's from an injury or old age or lifestyle. What matters is the effect upon the humors. Diagnosis, then, is determining what is wrong with the humors. Treatment is in correcting the humors. This means when you're treating an illness, you're not treating, for example, a pathogen. You're treating the host. You're treating the body itself. And in balancing the body, you're strengthening the body to get rid of that pathogen. So this is the foundation of the humoral model of the body and the medicine that treats it. Although at this point it's still kind of vague. We haven't yet defined the specifics of individual body processes, and so we haven't defined the specifics of body breakdown. And we also haven't talked at all about diagnosis. And all of those are large topics for the future. But for now, if you've made it this far, then I really appreciate you watching. And if you're interested in deep dives into classical medical thinking, particularly theory and herbalism, then please like and subscribe for more content to come. And if you have anything that you want to add, please feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks.